Hello, everyone, and welcome to At Barrons. I'm Andy Serwer, and welcome to our guest, Richard White, CEO of WiseTech Global, coming to us from Australia. Richard, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a bit early here, but it's a lovely day. The sun's out already.
Excellent. So, first of all, tell us about your company, WiseTech. It's been an incredible success. We'll talk about that, but just describe to me what you guys are in the business of doing.
So WiseTech provides logistics execution software largely to the international logistics and freight forwarding community. It's a big area. There's a lot of volume in this space, and the players in it are very large. People like DHL, which people would recognize, FedEx, UPS. These are all global customers of ours, and many of the others. We have 13 of the top 25 in that space rolled out or rolling out globally, and we have business with all of the top 25 and much of the top 200 as well. So we've got a very powerful platform, which is very different to other pieces of technology, that is very integrated, very global, and very real time. And we make the process of international logistics a much simpler and much more complete process.
Right. So, two questions. What's your annual run rate now in terms of revenue? And two, why can't these companies sort of do these kinds of platforms on their own?
We're approaching $1 billion revenue this year, just a bit above it actually, and I'm talking Australian dollars here. And the companies that we supply have traditionally built their own systems. The last of those that I think was completely successful was probably in the 90s. This is a very, very complex industry with many moving parts and a lot of regulatory burden and risk associated with the process of international movements. You've got customs entries at the origin and destination. You've got compliance requirements. The layering of this is so large that it makes it very hard for anybody to do that, except at the scale that WiseTech is.
So can you give me a kind of a practical example? Say I'm one of your big customers like DHL.
Yeah.
I log onto your platform to do what exactly? And then what am I tracking? Am I tracking the packages? No, I'm tracking the shipping, the ships or the airplanes, or what am I doing exactly?
We can definitely do all of those things, but let me explain. Let me do an origin, a soup to nuts, an origin to destination story. So somebody in an import country needs to acquire some product. That would usually be a large shipment because it might be to a major retailer or a distributor. That order is placed and tracked through our system. The manufacturer then provides statuses back to the system about where the order is being manufactured and how it's being manufactured and when it's going to be provided. Then once that's complete, there is a container or an air freight unit made available, and that is either delivered loose to a packing depot or the container is delivered to the warehouse. This is all done on our system as a planning mechanism. The container is then moved by road to the port of origin. There would be a number of formalities about entering the port and managing what's inside the container. If it's going to the US, there would be a number of customs entries required before the container is loaded on the vessel. Advanced manifesting and importer security filings have to be done. They're all electronic. We do those. The container is then tracked. We've been tracking the container since it was picked up at the empty container depot. The container is passed through the gate of the terminal. The export customs entries is done, say, in China or somewhere in Asia. We do that customs entry. It's put under the vessel. We know that the container's been placed on the vessel by electronic messaging. We have the vessel schedule. We have the rates for the vessel. We know what's going on with that vessel when it departs, what the weather is on the sea, what the vessel is traveling at. We know that we can see the vessel in real time. When it arrives, the vessel, we also know the container comes off the vessel. We have a customs entry for consumption at the other country, in this case, the US. We get a complex customs entry. Then there's a road freight movement of that container back to the warehouse where it's going to get unpacked. And then the container is also moved via our software management to a de-hire location where the container is returned to the shipping line. That was about 20 or 30 different actions to do that entire thing. We make that look like one seamless overall transaction that for the user of that container or the manufacturer or the importer, it just looks like a single process.
Well, almost as impressive as that transactions is your ability to remember it all. So I mean that's a lot of stuff going on there. So is this a competitive business? Are there others doing this?
Well, WiseTech has become, in its own time, and using the investments we've made in technology, we're now the largest logistics software company in the world in this space by far. In the last 5 years, for instance, we spent $1 billion on R&D, and our run rate going forward is something like 360, 370 million this year alone. And it's growing in lockstep with our revenues as we grow our revenues, which are quite considerable growth rates. We are also increasing our R&D spend, and we've been spending an enormous amount of time being a highly efficient software developer. We've spent the last 20 years really working hard on how to make software work at scale, and how that R&D process gives us more bangs per dollar than anybody else can get. That's probably one of the most significant secret sources of the company.
Right, but are there others doing what you're doing?
Yeah, we do have other companies, but typically they're domestic and they're smaller and they don't do this on a global scale. It's not like we don't have competitors. The main competition would be the in-house legacy systems, which have been around for 20 or 30 years and really are very hard to displace because nobody knows how they were built, nobody knows how to replace them. And so customers generally just have no understanding of what to do because they've never been involved in a transition from one system to another. But we've also made that very easy. And in fact, a number of customers have gone live in recent times much more rapidly and with greater ease than they've ever done before.
Right, right. And by the way, for people who are wondering, the stock does trade in the United States, ticker WTC. I noticed that it looks like you guys went public in 2016 at around $4. The stock trades almost at 97 or 100 here. Wow, $32 billion market cap. That's a lot of growth. Is it an expensive stock? The PE looks pretty high right now, though.
I think, well, first of all, it was April 11, 2016, and it was $3.35 was the listing price.
Well, you would remember that, I'm sure.
Yeah, that was a very important day for the company and for myself. I think the reason the market prices us so well is because we've done an enormously positive job of growing the business. We've been reliably growing the business since listing, but equally, we're also very, very profitable and very cash generative. Quite an odd thing in technology companies, except at scale. So I think we get a premium because we're both very high growth and very profitable and continuing to improve both of those numbers.
Right, and you said $1 billion run rate, and I'm curious as what you think the TAM is, the total addressable market for the company.
I find the concept of a TAM a bit odd when you're breaking into new markets and creating things of new value. I mean, if you think about it, what was the TAM for an iPhone or smartphones when Apple produced the iPhone? The TAM was zero. And in fact, I think it's really a rearward-looking idea about what legacy software is worth, and it's not what we do. We actually create enormous productivity and reduce risk and make things much simpler and easier and safer for everybody involved, our customers and their customers. And that value creation is what we're actually extracting. We're creating an enormous amount of productivity, enormous amount of risk reduction, and an enormous amount of simplification. And I think you're getting the TAM for me is hard to measure, but it's extremely large. And as well as that, we've been working to move into new markets that are adjacent to ours. For instance, we recently made a number of acquisitions in the last year or so into what is called US landside logistics, which is really container transport from the port to the door or from the door to the port. And that's a very big market. It's very complex and it's very inefficient. And we believe we can get a substantial efficiency premium out of that market. And that efficiency premium is really massive because that's a very, very costly part of the process. So each of the things we're doing in global customs, in our warehouse suite, in the international transport forwarding, in this landside logistics, and a number of other adjacent areas are themselves large in comparison with what we've already done. So we've got probably a TAM of 10 times what we're doing now without even thinking about other adjacencies.
Wow, yeah. So as a percentage of global trade, and then even beyond that with those adjacent businesses you're talking about. And you have Wall Street analysts here in New York covering the company these days?
We have about, I think we have about 18 analysts covering the business across the various investment banks. I don't have the list of them here, but I focus on running the business, not running the IR. But my role is very specific. I've got a very strategic understanding of the company, and I don't know if you know this, but I wrote the original software in the 90s that actually started the company. So I'm very technical, and I have a very strong view of the product. I have a very, very strong understanding of the market that we service and the customers that we help.
Right, so it's an overnight success, 30 years in the making, as so many overnight success stories are. Right.
That's true. Yeah.
And so, Richard, is it an advantage being in Australia, or a disadvantage, or a neutral?
All problems are opportunities, and all difficulties are things that you can overcome and make into advantages. I think Australia has, it's a stable economy. It's got a strong system. It's a comfortable place to be for us. We're very naturally in this marketplace. And if you think about it, in the mornings, as I'm doing now, I can deal with my US customers, my US staff, and my US business quite easily. And in the early evenings, I can deal with probably 2/3 of a day in Europe. I can get a lot of work done. That means my days are quite long, but I'm very passionate about the company. And so for me, being in Australia is just a convenience. I do travel a lot, of course. I was in the US last week in San Francisco. I'm heading out, as you would always expect, to do other business in Europe and other places. But I think Australia gives us a natural advantage because we're comfortable here and we're well located.
A lot of people, Richard, talk about how global trade is changing. I mean, some people are saying, oh, it's the death of globalism. We're now know that that's not really true at all. It's just changing in many ways. How is global trade changing right now, and how does that affect your business?
Well, you can see that there is an enormous pressure to change the nature of global trade, and that's somewhat of a political process. But there are physical attributes that are coming from that. For instance, Mexico has risen to be the largest importer into the US now, greater than China. But those sort of changes to us look like opportunities, because whenever you change global trade, it raises the complexity level of the processes in global trade. And we are really very strong and very capable of making those processes simple. So when you're doing more across Asia, when you're doing nearshoring, when you're doing various other things to remove some of the tension from the trade systems, or to get around something like the problems happening in the Suez or the Panama. These things are always problems that are solvable. And logistics is a very flexible industry, and we provide a lot of that flexibility and that ability to reconfigure around the current state of what's going on.
Right, Panama Canal, they have drought problems. Obviously, the problems in the straits between Yemen and Djibouti have to do with the rebels firing at ships there. Can you give us what is the latest going on there in that part of the world, and how is that impacting your business?
Well, if you look at it purely from a logistics point of view, I'm not going to speak to the security issues or the military issues. That's not my pay grade. But when a problem like that happens, you have to change the way that the freight moves, and this effectively means where the vessels are sailing. And so most of the major shipping lines now are sailing around the Horn rather than going through that particular area where there's problems. And I think what that does is it stretches the supply chain. It makes the time for delivery a couple of weeks longer. And that means that you have to have more product on the water in order to make the supply chain stable. You also have to have more shipping. So this is, from a purely economic point of view, it's a slight benefit to us to have that sort of ability to move around those things. But generally speaking, putting the military issues aside, the trade that is around that space is still running at the normal process. It's a bit longer to happen. There's a bit more commodity on the water, but other than that, it's still running quite smoothly.
Right. By the way, what percentage of the company do you own, by the way?
I control a little under 40% of the company. 39 point something. I can't remember the exact percentage. I don't look at my stock every day. I'm much busier trying to grow the company than worrying about how much stock I own.
Good. Well, sounds like you're doing pretty well with it then. So I want to end things here, Richard, and ask you a little bit about your personal story. I understand that before you got into shipping, before you got into software, you were a rock and roller, or at least involved in the rock and roll business. Talk to us a little bit about that, and then how that prepared you for being a shipping logistics mogul.
So I started out of high school. I'm not sure if I wanted to meet girls or I wanted to have myself a bit more personality and character, but I started playing. I played various other instruments, but I started playing guitar, and that seemed like a cool thing. My father was an engineer and didn't like the idea of me being a musician, but he allowed me, provided I did work with him and did my sort of courses to understand how engineering works. So I had a kind of a dual thing. I worked with my father, who's an engineer, during the day, and I worked as a musician at night. I really describe myself as an economic refugee from the music industry, because when I started becoming a full-time musician, I realized it was a pretty hard gig, and the money was poor, and it was a pretty unsavory environment, you know. So I quickly flipped to repairing musical instruments, which was my second job and my first business that I owned. That was extremely successful, and in fact, I did a lot of guitar repair work for AC/DC, for Angus and Malcolm, for a number of other very famous Australian bands. And I learned about running a business. It was a very successful business. And then I went into manufacturing lighting equipment, which got me into computing. And once I hit computing, I realized that there was an entire world of capability that was really quite exciting to have. And that there drove me into eventually meeting international logistics companies and freight forwarders, and realizing that the software opportunity in there was huge, and therefore it rolled into WiseTech.
I love it, Richard. You went from the highway to hell with AC/DC onto the shipping lanes around the world. That's perfect. Richard White, CEO of WiseTech Global, thank you so much for joining us.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you very much.
This is at Barrons. I'm Andy Serwer. We'll catch you next time.